All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this month's edition of the Cyber Showcase, where we'll be covering vendor management in the year 2024. I'm your host, Brett Rock, a business development and product specialist here with SBS Cybersecurity. And today I'm very grateful to be joined by one of our absolute best. And frankly, there's nobody at the company better equipped to discuss today's topic with us than our senior information security consultant and ISO, Laura Zanucci. So Laura, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself really quickly?
So I'm Laura Zanucci. I've been with SBS for almost 9 years, and I've done a little bit of everything, audit and consulting, and now I'm in the exciting world of vendor management. So I'm really excited about talking to you today about what the new things are for 2024.
Great. Well, as Laura kind of highlighted, and as you probably read in the description of today's webinar, our goal today is to discuss what vendor management looks like right now, particularly in light of the interagency guidance that was released last year. So we're going to talk a lot about how that guidance is impacting exams currently. Laura's got some good anecdotes there, why using vendors is important, period, why managing them is important, and then we'll get into some of the big changes or kind of the bigger changes, I should say, as well as how SBS can actually help in this process as well. So just kind of a couple of housekeeping items. If you have questions, this is our first use of the Teams meeting for our Cyber Showcase. Up to this point, we've been using GoTo for this one. So I apologize in advance for any hiccups. Hopefully we won't have too many of those. If you have any questions, there is a Q&A box. We'll be happy to address those at the end if time allows. If not, we'll certainly get back to you on a one-on-one basis. And then there are going to be some polls that I'm going to launch toward the end of this. And if you don't mind taking a minute to just look through those and throw us some answers, we really appreciate that as well. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into things. So from an agenda perspective, or I guess I should start with on the right-hand side of the screen, if you're not looking at our cameras right now, that is, those are our photos, Laura and myself. Our contact information as well. I imagine I speak for Laura when I say that if you have questions today and don't want to put them in the box, go ahead and shoot us an email or give us a call. I know we're happy to help as much as we can. In terms of the agenda, we are going to start with introductions and the agenda, what's coming from SBS really quickly. We're going to reflect on the interagency guidance. Again, that came out in June of last year. The top 5 changes and how their impact may be felt or is being felt currently. How SBS can help. We'll give you some takeaways. And then if we have time, we'll have some question and answers as well. But before I get into any of that, I do want to just kind of ask, I'm going to put Laura right on the spot right off the bat here. Why is vendor management such a hot topic, Laura? And I preface that by saying, out of all the cyber showcases I've ever done, and out of all of the blog posts we do and a lot of the different things that we do as a company, vendor management generally is the most popular. In fact, this is the most attendees we've ever had for a cyber showcase that I put on is here today. So maybe just start by telling us a little bit about why you think vendor management is such a hot topic.
I think it's such a hot topic because it's new guidance. It's new guidance that replaced guidance that was really old in the past. And we all know with new guidance, especially joint guidance, that the examiners are really going to be in there. They've got something that's consistent that they're going to be able to use. And they know that, the banks should understand it now. We're all on the same page. So everyone wants to make sure they get it right. So we're in here talking about it. It's not the most exciting thing, but we really want to make sure that we get it done correctly. And I think, too, maybe with some of the vendor management breaches and problems in the past, we want to make sure that we're getting it right.
I think that's absolutely true. And the only thing I would add to that, and you may feel differently and feel free to say so, but this is just hard to do, right? Vendor management is not something that's simple. It's not something that up until this point, there was a lot of different guidance from a lot of different places. Obviously, we think the interagency guidance should help there to some degree, but this is just something that is a challenge, and it's not fun, and it's not, as you mentioned, not terribly exciting, and sometimes it can be hard to see what the value is, but we do believe there is value there, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, let's get into things just quickly. A little bit about us as a company. If you've never heard of us before or haven't talked to us before, hopefully this will be helpful. If you've working with us, we greatly appreciate that partnership. Hopefully it's a good reminder. We have been in the industry for 20 years now, something we're very proud of. In fact, we celebrated the big 2-0 earlier this year. And what I think is really important about that is this is what we do. We are not a managed service provider that said, let us do your network security work. We're not an accounting firm that said, let us do your IT audits. Not to knock either of those types of organizations. They're really good. But we do believe that having that independence and being just on this side of things is really critical and really helps us as we move forward as a company. So auditing, consulting, education, products and services, all those different sorts of things. That's what we do. It's what we eat, breathe, sleep, drink. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the services and products we've got at the company. I do want to, for anybody who's heard of the tool Track, we've got more than 1,400 organizations using that in over 40 states. We're endorsed across the country by a number of state banking associations. One thing we're very proud of, we were recently ranked #1 for cybersecurity consulting by G2. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, that's Gartner's consulting review. Actually, I apologize. That's not Gartner. That's another company. But again, we have been ranked #1 for our cybersecurity consulting by our customers. So we encourage you to go ahead and take a look at that. All kinds of educational offerings. Track that's where the Gartner comes in. My apologies. We're rated very highly there. And then Laura is one of our excellent team members when it comes to all of the different things that we do, whether that's predefining data in Track or working with you on consulting or auditing or education or whatever the case may be. I do want to make a quick plug for what we've got coming up here. Dylan Kretzfeld, one of our experts when it comes to M365, is going to be hosting a webinar for our SBS Institute. We do that on a monthly basis as well. That will be the ultimate guide to Microsoft 365 security. I'm sure a lot of you are M365 users. There's over 1 million companies and 345 million users globally right now. But as you probably know, your software is only as good as the security controls that you've implemented to protect it. So Dylan will be covering all kinds of great information about how you can do the best job you can in protecting yourself when it comes to the M365 platform. So encourage you to take a look at that as well. All right, so let's jump into things. So I kind of like to start here. Why do we need vendors at all? So, there's a lot of different reasons out there. It can help create efficiencies, help create control costs rather, helps us provide solutions that we otherwise might not be able to, helps us increase focus on core business functions, and really accelerates the delivery of services in a lot of ways. So again, a lot of really positive benefits. Now, I can't speak to Laura's got so much more expertise when it comes to this than I do. So I'm gonna pause and give you the floor here, Laura. I know you've been in the financial services industry for a long time. You've been at banks. You've been with us for a long while. How has the attitude toward using vendors evolved over your career? What have you seen in that experience?
Well, when I started banking in the 90s, vendor management was mainly looking at the contract. Management would be looking at the contract, and there was little or no work done related to due diligence before engaging the vendor or even monitoring the vendor after the performance or during the duration of the contract. So that has changed a lot over time. Of course, we had the FDIC guidance and the OCC guidance that came out later. So in the beginning, it wasn't a lot of review on that. And we didn't really do a whole lot of work. There was really no software out there with, your questions that you wanted to answer. So it's changed quite a bit.
And in terms of kind of using vendors, right? I mean, I mentioned some of the benefits that I kind of have heard from different companies and organizations and institutions I've talked to. I imagine you would agree that as we continue to move forward, it's not as though we're going to be using fewer vendors. Chances are good if we're growing and things like that. The number of vendors we're going to be working with is likely to grow and not really contract. Is that fair?
That would be, yes, a fair statement.
Absolutely. So in terms of, we know why we need them, right? They do all those great things for us. It's kind of a necessary evil to some degree. So why do we need to manage them? What's the big reason behind just, outside of the, hey, because we're told we have to, what are some of the big reasons why we need to be managing our vendors?
So one of the things is you need to understand their security controls, make sure that they're in place and that they're adequate. And you need to know if there are issues. So you'll be looking, on those critical vendors or even the significant vendors. You're going to be looking at those SOC reports to make sure there's no noted issues. And then you really need to understand their financial part. So the examiners are looking a little bit more at that now too, but you need to understand that they're financially viable and that they'll be able to continue business during the term of your contract. Um, and you want a vendor that's going to help you move forward with your IT goals and your bank strategic goals.
Yeah, and we talk a lot as a company, and usually I have a slide for this. So if anybody who has been to this cyber showcase in the past thinks I might have missed a step there, I kind of tried to spare people of it this time. But we talk a lot about being proactive as opposed to being reactive. It's not we kind of pitch it as it's not just the check the box mentality. Okay, we looked at a contract, we may have kind of glanced at their financials, we can check the box and we can move on. That's okay as long as you're doing some of that work. But what are the real benefits to managing a vendor well and understanding, okay, well, obviously they have our data. We've got a big footprint out there with a bunch of vendors that we've got. What are the benefits to being able to say we are being proactive and it's not just something that we're checking the box on?
Your primary goal is to protect your customers' information. So if you don't understand your vendors, you're not going to be able to say that you can actually protect that information. And like I said, you just got to make sure that they're going to support your goals going forward. So a lot of times you'll have one vendor, but they'll be doing multiple things for you. So you just need to understand, basically like you would in lending, you need to understand that concentration risk as well.
Okay. Absolutely. And I was taking a look recently at there was a 2022 Gartner study that said on vendor management and risk, 84% of respondents had experienced operational disruption as a result of a vendor incident. So that's a pretty substantial number of organizations and institutions that had that operational disruption. 66% said they experienced adverse financial impact, and about 60% said either increased regulatory scrutiny or had adverse reputational impact. So obviously there's a lot of threats out there. It's not, for having and using vendors. There's a lot of great reasons to do it, a lot of benefits that come from it. But as we always say, you can outsource the product, the service, the solution, but you can't outsource the risk, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So, okay. So one of the things, and before we start really looking into the guidance itself, one of the things that I think it laid out pretty clearly, and it kind of added to a little bit, and at least in my experience, is kind of the idea of what the life cycle of vendor management looks like. So, just to kind of go through these pieces really quickly, it all starts with the planning piece, right? So that's where we're thinking about, do we even need to do this? What are the benefits of doing it? What are the threats? How are we going to pick a vendor? What are the costs? So Laura, when you are, when in your past, when you were picking a vendor or thinking about offering a new product or service or anything like that, what kind of drives that conversation of, do we need a vendor for this? Can we do it internally? Do we need to be doing it at all? Kind of, how is that planning process started in your experience?
So you would have a need. So you would have a need and you would look at the resources you have internally. Could you manage it internally? Would it be more efficient for it to be outsourced? A lot of those conversations are had, when you're looking at core providers, what is the cost of changing from one specific vendor to another. But it's really all about efficiencies and maybe the lack of resources or expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things, we're going to talk as part of one of the bigger changes, or one of the things that they hammered home pretty carefully on the interagency guidance, was the idea that vendor management is a part of risk management overall, right? And I always kind of think, and I know our company is big on, a lot of that is driven by that IT risk assessment, right? So it's we're going to look at that. We're going to, before we even bring a product or service on, or before we even start to think about, really anything else, we're going to take a look at it and say, okay, so what are the benefits? What are the threats that are out there? What controls do we have in place to mitigate those threats? What controls would we need to add? What kind of questions would we want to ask a vendor? So obviously that plays into that as well, correct?
Yes, it does. We need to understand those controls up front to make sure that they're going to be the same as what we would do if we were doing it ourselves.
Sure. So let's say we planned, we figured out we're going to do it, we're going to move forward. That moves to the due diligence section. So what should you be considering when you're selecting a vendor? And we're going to talk a lot more about that, because that's something that was kind of a real big change in my estimation when it came to that interagency guidance. So Next would be contract negotiation. Again, same idea here. That's something that we're going to talk more about, but that's how do we make sure the contract meets our business goals and our risk management needs. We move on to your ongoing monitoring, right? So those are your ongoing reviews of the vendors that you've got to make sure that they're meeting our goals and our contractual requirements and things like that. So Laura, I do want to pause here with a question as well, because I know this is something that comes up a lot, is what does ongoing monitoring mean? Even in the interagency guidance, they didn't really come out and say, hey, you should be doing this annually, or this one you should be looking at every other year, or anything like that. What do you typically see in terms of what is an ongoing review?
So your critical vendors, which would be along the lines of your core, you're going to be looking at those annually. So you're going to be requesting the required documentation. You're going to get it annually and do the review. How we set them up here at SBS is if it's a significant vendor, we look at the same documentation. A lot of times that we're looking for that critical vendor, we're just doing it every other year. And then our level 3s, which are important enough to be looking at and maybe have a contract for or insurance for, we're going to look at those every 3 years. So we do all of that based off of the risk assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm actually stealing this right out of the guidance. So ongoing monitoring may be conducted on a periodic or continuous basis, and more comprehensive or frequent monitoring is appropriate when a third-party relationship supports higher risk activities, including critical activities. So that feels like a long way of saying we're not going to tell you exactly what you need to be doing, but the more critical the vendor, obviously, the more often you should be looking at them. And it does seem like there is a little bit of a focus on maybe, hey, just collecting documents once a year and taking a quick glance at them is probably not going to be enough any longer. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. That's what we did in the, in the 2000s, the early 2000s. We would just get the documentation and say, yes, we got the documentation. And we may review it or may not. And they didn't ask us for any additional information. So as long as they were happy back then and we were getting the documentation, we really weren't too concerned at that point. But we weren't highly electronic like what we are now either.
Sure. Absolutely. So, and then probably, well, it is the last piece, and probably the one that maybe people don't think about quite as much, is termination, right? So it's easy enough to say, okay, we've decided we're not going to work with this company anymore, but we really need to be, thinking about, if we do terminate this relationship, are we doing it in an efficient manner? Is it consistent with the contract, and making sure that we get those cancellations in time? And if necessary, do we have a plan in place for a continuity of offerings, which is kind of, again, a longhand way of saying, if we stop offering or using this vendor for a particular product or service or solution, do we have a plan in place to mitigate any risk of them not being around any longer? So I do think you will see this if you take a look at the interagency guidance. They do spell this out pretty clearly, and I do think this is one of those areas that is probably a real benefit, right? Being able to say, okay, we have a better grasp of what this life cycle looks like from start to finish. So with that said, let's talk about the guidance itself. Now, again, this came out in June of last year, and there were a lot of there was a pretty long commentary period. I think the guidance does a pretty good job of talking about some of those different comments and how they were integrated into the eventual final guidance. But Laura, just quickly remind us, when was the last time that any real guidance had been released prior to this interagency guidance that came out last year?
So each agency had their own guidance. The FDIC's was from June of 2008. The OCC had published their primary document in October of 2013, and then they had a supplement document to go along with it. And then the Federal Reserve also published, similar to the OCC, theirs in December of 2013. So there was a bit of a time frame gap between all the guidance to actually it being published last year.
Yeah, and when I think about what has changed in the last 10 years in just my life, let alone in running a financial institution or an organization, right, it seems like that's a pretty big gap of time to have an idea of what you should be doing, right?
It definitely is. So we were extremely excited when that new guidance came out.
So speaking of that, what do you think was the goal? I mean, obviously, one of the big changes we'll talk about is that it was an interagency guidance. What do you think the goal of this guidance was?
I think it was consistency between the agencies, which is really good. It was to make it a little bit easier for financial institutions to have that guidance. And then also, which a lot of people don't think about, it makes it easier for the vendor because they know that each financial institution is going to be asking for the same documentation, is going to be asking the same questions.
So I know you mentioned we had some conversations leading up to this in preparation. Do we have a sense? I know you have some customers that you're working with that have been through exams already, and then some that are preparing for exams. What are you seeing so far in terms of since this guidance was released? What has that experience been for those that have gone through it?
So when the examiners have come in, and I've had a couple clients have already been audited or about to be examined by the FDIC. They've asked a lot about financials. They want to know, have you looked at the financials? Do you understand it? Which is before we didn't have as much focus on the financials. They're asking a lot about the user entity controls. So if you have a level one, if you have a critical vendor, you definitely want to pull out those user entity controls from a SOC report if they have one, and make sure that that you at the bank have those controls in place, because they're saying the SOC is not important. The SOC is not sufficient if you're not putting those controls in place that they're saying need to be there. And then the other thing is, if your vendor has any type of access to customer information, you're going to want to go ahead and request, information security documents, a controls audit. You need to understand if they're touching or in any way your customer information, that you understand their controls. So a lot of times that falls in to a insignificant vendor to the bank, but if they have access to any of your customer information, you're going to have to understand them up front and during the due diligence, the oversight process as well.
Sure. So have there been any common findings throughout any of those, or anything that stands out that as a company we're starting to kind of focus on when we help our customers? Or is it just kind of more of what you're highlighting there?
It's more of what I'm highlighting here. Is just understanding that each vendor that you have needs to be considered. It needs to be considered in a risk assessment. And then you need to have procedures that go along with what you're going to do for each one of those levels of vendor.
Absolutely. And we're probably I imagine, and I'm not an examiner, so I can't say this definitively, but this is a big change. They're probably getting their arms wrapped around it a little bit. And certainly I think as they continue to roll it out, there may even be additional changes that we might see, or highlights or areas of emphasis, correct?
Correct. And I think that would be a good thing maybe for us to do at the end of the year, do another showcase or a hacker hour and say, hey, this is what we've seen throughout the year. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes throughout the year with examiners and actually with auditors.
Sure. Okay. So we know it was important. We know that there were some changes that started to be felt, and probably as those of you on the call that have exams coming up, you'll probably start to feel some of those impacts. Let's just talk about some of the changes, because I don't think there was anything that was massive, right, Laura? I don't think there was anything that was like, oh, we've never even thought of this before. I mean,
right.
A lot of the changes that we're going to talk about, even that we consider to be fairly large changes, most of the companies and organizations and institutions that are doing a really good job with vendor management probably were already doing a lot of these things. Is that fair?
Yes. The guidance for the FDIC was a lot less than what it was for the OCC and the Fed.
Mm-hmm.
So the people who were FDIC previously, who were following the fill, they'll be the ones that experience the most. OCC and Fed, it's not going to really change a whole lot for you, because you're already looking at the majority of this anyway.
Absolutely. That's good to know. All right, so let's talk about some of the changes. So the first one, and we've talked about it a little bit already, but just to kind of hit on it again, is this was obviously a much more coordinated response from regulatory agencies. In the past, it's always been, okay, we have the FDIC's is over here, and OCC has theirs, and the Fed has theirs, and FFIEC has some information. So, why do you think this is so important, Laura, that we've got this coordinated response from the regulatory agents, and kind of why is that so different than what it's been done in the past?
So with this coordinated approach, they're wanting to promote risk-based vendor management reviews. They're wanting you to consider those stages before their stages, of course, have always been there. It makes sense, but maybe considering those stages and how you manage it during each one of those. And then two, they want you to have a consistent approach to those third-party reviews. And it's intended to be, the guidance is really intended to be a useful resource for us to effectively manage risk with those vendor relationships. And taking in, there's basically said that it was going to be customizable. So they're saying that you should consider your complexity and the size of your organization and take the guidance as a reference, because during the what does it, speak to the regulators, or where they did their first webinars with us, they were saying not to use it as a word for word checklist. So if you're a smaller bank, you don't have to ask these 40 questions related to due diligence. Maybe you could bring it down just a little bit. So it's supposed to be risk-based and customizable for all the institutions.
Absolutely. And I also think that just getting that coordinated response, right? Them working together.
Right.
So it's not, okay, I have to go and look at this specific set of guidance, but the bank down the street or the other organization or institution has to look at something different. And just having that, everybody being on the same page. I mean, you make an excellent point, even for the vendors, even for vendors like us who go in and help organizations get prepared for exams and audits and things like that. I would imagine that's helpful as well.
Definitely so.
So that's kind of the big one. That this was in the past it was kind of scattershot. This was a much more coordinated response, and maybe some of us are wondering why it took so long, but we are finally here, which is great. So the second big one, and again, I think a lot of us are already doing this already, but the idea that vendor management is a part of overall risk management. So again, I'm not sure this is a massive change for anybody who really worked in vendor management, but can you kind of put it, Laura, in terms of in perspective, in terms of where vendor management should fit into that overall risk management program? I know we've got the whole blueprint. I tried to find the most updated copy, but struck out on that one on our server here. But kind of why is this? Where does it fit in that risk management program?
So I love talking about this. I do this in a lot of the trainings that I do. Just consider your risk management as a pyramid. On the bottom, you're going to have your IT risk assessment. In the middle, you're going to have your vendor management risk assessment. And on top of that, you're going to have your business continuity management. So vendor management is what ties everything together. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. So your assets are provided most likely from a vendor. So you're going to tie your assets to a vendor. You're going to do that vendor risk assessment. And then when you're working on your business processes and your dependencies inside of your business impact analysis, you're going to say, hey, these are the vendors that we're relying on to get this business process completed. And is that vendor that we're relying on, is their availability really important? Because if it is, what are they rated and what do we know about their controls? So really vendor management ties both the IT assets and the business continuity management together.
Yeah. It couldn't have said it any better myself. I love the risk pyramid, something we talk about a lot, but what I've seen a lot in the past, in my experience, is kind of that siloed approach, right? Vendor management's over here and we do it on a spreadsheet, business continuity's over there and somebody else handles it. And then we have a tool for IT risk assessment. And those things just never talk to one another, right? It makes it a real challenge to have a really good understanding of your risk management program overall. Am I right in saying that?
Definitely so, because if you've got separate departments doing separate things, if they don't communicate, then you're not going to understand, how important that vendor is, how much information they're getting, and is it tying into the assets? Do we have the right controls on the assets based on the vendor? So yes, definitely, if it's siloed, it's going to make everyone's job a lot harder to do.
Yeah, I always think of it, and people have probably, if you've been to a track demo before, which I handle, I always talk about it like if I were to go to a movie tonight and everybody in the movie had a different script, right? The producer, the director, the actors, everybody, cameraman, everybody had a different script. It would probably wind up being a pretty lousy movie, right? People would be talking over one another. The dialogue wouldn't make sense. There'd be plot twists that come out of nowhere and don't go anywhere. that's what it feels like sometimes when we talk to companies that, or organizations or institutions that have this all spread out. It's like they're all working off of different scripts and none of it ties together. So, I think that having the guidance come really right out and say, this needs to be a part of that overall risk management, I think will be helpful going forward. So that's kind of the second biggest change, or change number 2, at least. The third one, and I think this is a really interesting one, is really just greater specificity when it comes to due diligence. And I think, and Laura, I know you're going to hit on this, is particularly when it comes to selecting vendors, right? So in the past, or at least in my experience in talking to financial institutions and other organizations, it could kind of be the selection part could be kind of the wild, wild west, right? The lending department, not to knock them, but the lending department decided we're going to use a new lending platform. They pick the vendor they want, they sign the contract, and then they send the information over to the vendor manager and they can say, okay, you can do your work now. Obviously, that was really never the way it was intended to be done. But certainly, I think this guidance really hits home on selecting vendors being a really critical component in terms of how you manage your vendors. So I'll just kind of turn the floor over to you here. I know you've got some thoughts on this as well.
It's funny when you say that, because I have personal experience with that. I was sitting in my office working one day, and the CEO comes in and flings a contract on my desk. Oh, by the way, we have a new vendor. Whatever you need to do, go ahead and do it. But at that point, it was already signed. It was, so if they were terrible, we were locked in, right? So the guidance really specifies that you should know beforehand, what you're going to request so you can make the best and most informed decision. And the good thing about this is you're going to pretty much have the same questions for every vendor that you use. So over time, it's going to be easier and easier because you know what you're looking for and what needs to be done. The one thing that I'd probably think would be a negative related to this was, by doing all that upfront review, you're actually going to slow your process down. And a lot of when executive management, the board of directors, when they decide sometimes that they want something, they want it done, and they want it done right then. With this, it's not something that can happen right away. If any of you work in vendor management now, sometimes it's hard to get that documentation. So it's really important to get it in that first sales process, because they're going to get it to you faster because they're trying to close those things. So it does slow down the process a little bit. But once our vendors get used to what we're asking for and what we want to know, I think the whole entire process will be easier. But like I said, I think the focus is to make sure you get the decision right up front, so you don't have to worry about it when you're doing the oversight and realize that you've made a mistake.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned this previously when we were talking as well. It's almost as though they're saying, do the greatest amount of due diligence before you even pick a vendor, so that it's easier when you're doing it in an ongoing capacity, right?
That is true. And then something else that we need to make sure people understand, if you're looking at a critical vendor, it's important to get a variety of vendors. So just don't focus on one and do the due diligence there, because how do you know you're getting the best product for your money if you don't look at additional ones? So we recommend that if you're going to be engaging a critical vendor, that you look at 3. If you're going to get a significant vendor, look at 2. So you have something that do a comparison. And that's part of your cost benefit analysis too. You want to make sure that you're getting, the most bang for your buck.
Yeah, certainly changing vendors is never an easy or a cost-effective thing to do. I mean, I've talked to a number of companies that have gone through core conversion changes, and I imagine that's the absolute worst case scenario. But the amount of time and energy and resources you have to put in, because maybe you picked the wrong one originally. I mean, that happens sometimes. That can be a pretty costly endeavor. I think one thing that's interesting, there are 14 subsections in the guidance that deal with due diligence. And I just took a look quickly. That's 11,283 words. And to put that in perspective, the United States Constitution and the Declaration of Independence contain 6,001 words combined. So basically twice the amount of words in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are in this due diligence section of the guidance. So I think that really clearly shows that level of specificity they're getting at. But I also think, Laura, you made a point on the last slide as well, is they're also very clear about not all vendors are equal and they shouldn't be treated equally. And not all institutions or organizations are equal. They shouldn't, necessarily have to do the exact same thing. So there are some level, there is some flexibility built in. Is that correct?
Yes, it should be customizable based on both the vendor and on based on the vendor and the bank. Someone just popped in a question about, are we referring to, I think it said a specific section. We're specifically talking about the joint guidance that came out in June of last year.
Yep. And I'll be linking to that. I have a link. I should have said this up front. If anybody wants the slide deck, I'm happy to send that after the fact. You can, our contact information will be up here, and I've linked to that in the, there's a resources section as well. But there's a specific due diligence section of that guidance that that lists out a bunch of different things that you should be looking at.
Two, I want to throw something out there. We did have an examiner cite the GLBA related to a vendor management finding. So I'll actually link that out to you guys later too, just to let you know they pulled from it, which I've never seen them pull from it before, but that's the section that they pulled from, saying that if they have customer information that they actually need to be doing some type of due diligence review. So I actually have had GLBA come back specifically. Oh, it says I'm breaking up. Specifically related to the GLBA.
So I think kind of what it boils down to, and I know this kind of comes through in the guidance if you've read it, but when selecting a vendor, they really talk about your ability to understand their ability to perform the activity as expected, to adhere to your organization or institution's policies, comply with applicable laws and regulations, and then conduct activity in a safe and sound manner. So again, I don't think it's like a massive change in terms of how we're going to pick vendors and what we would expect a vendor to do for us. It's just really a lot about how we go about that process. And I think, and I would hope this would be a positive in a lot of ways, giving you a lot of really good information as a person on the other end of this webinar, the ability to understand some of those different things you should be asking about. All right. So the fourth change, and this is a big one as well, is viewing contracts as a critical control. And if you thought the due diligence section was long, the contract negotiation section is actually 18,000 plus words. So they had a lot to say about this as well. But I know, Laura, the guidance lays out a lot of different components to consider when negotiating a contract. Why do you think it was important for them to do that? And then maybe how do you view that contract as a control when it comes to looking at a vendor?
So the big thing is, we're all bankers, so we're not lawyers. We didn't go to law school. Most of us, are business centric. So the thing that they're trying to do is the guidance is trying to give us direction on those key components related to the contract to help protect the bank, therefore protecting our customer. So contract revisions that could help mitigate risk. It helps mitigate risk by setting clear guidelines and allowing oversight and enforcement of standards. And then also it provides us with performance measures or benchmarks in there that we can make sure are being met. It has information security and confidentiality standards. And then all good contracts should have, a right to audit, owner and license considerations, and then, of course, compliance with laws and regulations. So those were like the high-level controls that I kind of pulled out for this that I would be looking at if I was looking at the contract.
And I think maybe to sum that up, and again, feel free to tell me if I do a bad job on this, but it's kind of like the more that is addressed in the contract, the less risk you're going to be taking on, right? If it's spelled out clearly, if we have a good understanding of what's supposed to be done and how it's supposed to be done and how we're going to measure that it was actually done and all those different sorts of things, the more that we can address in a contract, kind of the less risk that you are bringing on. So that's kind of, I think, why it's treating it like a control. Is that correct?
Right. So it's basically saying, we're doing this, so it's going to have their responsibilities, it's going to have your responsibilities, so it should be completely clear where those controls are coming from.
And I think that, I don't know if it says this exactly, it probably doesn't, but a bad contract, if we sign a bad contract, quote unquote, bad contract, that's not going to relieve me as an organization or institution of any risk, right? I mean, I can't go back to an examiner and say, hey, no, I didn't, this was sorry, I'm getting my reboot notice. Laura's going to make me a reboot when I'm done here. But having a bad contract and signing one that doesn't detail things as clearly, that doesn't relieve me I can't tell that to an examiner as an excuse, right?
You cannot.
Yeah. So, and I think one thing that it also talks a little bit about, and I'm a little sensitive to this because I'm on the sales side. We are our vendors ourselves, but vendors are probably going to want to enter into a standard contract, and it's just kind of up to you to decide what type of leverage you're going to use. You can choose to accept the contract as it is, maybe suggest some alterations and see if there's a compromise that can be had, or see if we can find an alternative or live without that service. So again, I think the idea of saying we're not just going to get a contract, take a quick look at it, and then sign it. I think they're looking, and again, Laura, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's just this guidance is really highlighting it and saying you just need to do a little bit more work than that because this is going to be protecting you and your customers in the long run. Correct?
That is correct.
All right. So the fifth big change, and this will be the last one, and then we'll talk about some of the things we can do to help you. And I think this is a cool one. It's recognition that vendor management is hard and that you can get help. And Laura, I know you've been through a lot more guidance than I have, and I'm sure everybody on the call has as well. But I don't know that I've ever seen that spelled out as clearly as it is in this interagency guidance. And I'm actually going to quote right from it, and then I'll ask you a question, Laura. But the quote is, with respect to commenters focusing on steps to limit the burdens of due diligence, including collaboration with other banking organizations and engaging with third parties that specialize in conducting due diligence, the agencies note that such collaborative efforts could be beneficial and reduce burden, especially for community banking organizations. So again, it's really just coming out kind of and saying, hey, we know this is not easy. We know we have a lot of expectations here. If you need to get help, you can do it. Is that kind of how you read that as well?
It's an advertisement for everyone that can do vendor management for financial institutions is basically what that is. They're saying it's okay. You don't have to keep it in-house. But it does stress in the guidance that even if you do outsource it, it is still your risk. So, but yes, I've never seen that in any guidance before. So I think it's really important that they understand that it is not an easy thing to do.
Absolutely. And then there was one more, a banking organization, and I know that everybody on the call is a financial institution, so I apologize, but that is the guidance. A banking organization may use the services of industry utilities or consortiums, consult with other organizations, or engage in joint efforts to supplement its due diligence. So again, really just coming out, and as Laura said, giving us an advertisement for anybody that can help. And I think that's a pretty beautiful segue into talking about some of the different things we can do as a company to help. Now, again, I would assume most of you on the call are familiar with SBS as a company. We do a lot of different things, but vendor management is one of those big pieces. And again, Laura is at the forefront for us in terms of developing the different programs and offerings that we've got. So we always like with these cyber showcases to not just talk about problems, but also talk about solutions. So we're going to spend a few more minutes here just talking about some of the different ways, excuse me, that we can help. So kind of the first one is our Track Vendor Management module. So you may not be familiar with this, but we do have a platform called Track. It helps automate different pieces of the information security program, whether that's IT risk assessments, business continuity management, excuse me, other types of risk assessments, and then certainly vendor management as well. Now, Laura, I know you're very familiar with Track and use it with some of our clients. Excuse me. Why do you think having a tool like this is so helpful?
So when I got this question, I could write a whole entire book. I could do a 2-hour seminar on why vendor management specifically module is really good. So first of all, it helps in the risk assessment, in the risk rating. So you don't just subjectively pick a number out of the air. So we do something called a protection profile. So we rate the vendor in 4 categories on confidentiality of the information, access to customer information, availability of vendor, and then the number of assets associated with that vendor. So by completing the risk rating, we understand what level that vendor is going to be. So it's going to be, if it's a critical vendor, this is the documentation that needs to be gathered, and all of that's there, and it tells you exactly what documentation needs to be gathered for that level of vendor. And it also says, hey, these are the questions that really should be answered for this level. Also, not only do you have consistency in the questions being asked, but you have a central repository for the documents received. So, so I was in banking for 20 plus years before coming to SBS, and I can't tell you the number of times I've looked at the contract and said, okay, or I've looked at the relationship and said, okay, where's the contract? And then you have a discussion with people that have been there, for 10 years. Who was here when we got that contract? Who signed it? Where do you think I could find it? So a lot of times, it was hard. It was Easter egg hunting, trying to find documents that had been used in the past in the selection for the ongoing monitoring if it hadn't been completed in the past. Another fun thing about TRAC is that when you put documents in, so it could be the contract, it could be the SOC report, it also lets you know when documents are expiring, when they're renewing. So you don't want to have a contract, that you've decided you're not going to use, and it's 30 days out, and you go back and look at the contract, and you had a 60-day window to tell them you weren't going to use them again, so you're stuck in that contract. So one of the beautiful things about TRAC is that you can put that in there, and it's going to email you saying, hey, you're in the time frame where you need to make a decision. Usually you do that 30 days before, and then it gives you that time to make that decision whether you want to cancel it or not. And then we have a lot of automated reports in there that you can provide to management, because, they don't want to get executive management and board of directors. They don't want to get in the weeds with you on those reviews. They want to see those high levels. So you can give them, this is how much risk we mitigated. This is the number of vendors we have. So it's really important that, you think of them when you're going to be providing them information too. So you need something where they can make those decisions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you did a better job than I would have, but I'm going to pull up some screenshots. Again, if you're not familiar with the tool, this is kind of what it looks like, but a little hard to see here, but there are 11 modules of the tool. They all work really well on their own. They work even better together. So when we talk about vendor management being a part of risk management overall, our IT risk assessment module feeds into our vendor management module. Both of them feed into business continuity. So we're kind of satisfying that piece of the guidance, but you can kind of see on the left-hand side here, TRAC is really built into 3 different pieces for vendor management. We have a setup, which is where we'll build the rules of the program. So as Laura mentioned, we can make sure we're following them. It doesn't make sense to have rules if we're not going to follow them. But also TRAC will then tailor itself to all of your vendors. So rather than saying, okay, am I doing too much work on a vendor? Am I not doing enough? TRAC eliminates that by taking the risk of the vendor, looking at your rules, and automatically marrying those 2 things together. We also think we have a very kind of a big differentiator in that we have a vendor selection part of our module. We just talked a lot about how important selection is with this new interagency guidance. That's something that we address right here in the tool, allow you to look at multiple vendors, follow the same workflows, collect all the same information and documentation, and do your due diligence and cost benefit and references and all that stuff in there. So you have that apples to apples comparison. So you can pick the right vendor. So that is the vendor selection. And then obviously we've got a vendor management section where all of that can be monitored in an ongoing capacity. You can go through the process for an individual vendor, reviewing them across the top. Again, that toolbar is built specifically for the vendor that you're looking at. And then as Laura highlighted, we've got all kinds of great and easy to read and easy to understand reports that we can pull from the tool as well. So Laura, before we move on to kind of the TRAC is great if you want to have a tool to help you. We've got another solution for anybody that needs even more support, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But Laura, if somebody said to you, you know what, I don't need TRAC, I've got a spreadsheet. And, again, spreadsheets in a lot of ways can keep you compliant. So there's really nobody, putting their thumb on you necessarily and saying, okay, you've got to make a change. But when somebody says, I don't need something like this, I've already got a spreadsheet I use, kind of what would your response to that be?
So spreadsheets were fine when we didn't have, guidance asking, 40 questions for a contract and 40 questions for due diligence. Then it also goes back to that siloed thing. So you're going to have to take that spreadsheet and provide it to whoever's doing the IT risk assessment. They'll have to provide it back to someone else who's doing the business continuity. I just don't think it's sufficient anymore. It used to be. Plus, you've got, larger chances of error. And then also, it's still very subjective on that risk rating and how you go about that unless you have something built in. It's just something that we did in the past that I don't think we can continue to do in the future.
Yeah, I always think about it like in terms of if I came to you to sell you a car, and you said you pointed out the window and you said, I don't need a car, I've got a donkey out there. Yeah, they both are going to get you where you need to go, but one's going to be a lot faster and more efficient, and you get a radio and air conditioning out of it too. So I think all of these things, again, not to be too smirky or anything like that, but that's kind of the idea of it, right? If we're using a spreadsheet, we can still do it that way. We can still get by from a compliance perspective, potentially, at least in the short term, but it is a much more time-consuming process. It's much more labor-intensive. As you mentioned, Laura, what we see a lot of is more errors, and not just errors in the sense that we answered something wrong or something like that, but even I typed something in the wrong place, or we accidentally deleted something, or whatever the case may be. It's just a lot more room for error there as well. So
and then the
we do believe
reporting.
that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and the reporting out to management and the board is not the same either. So in automated versions, you're going to get cleaner and nicer reports. Things are going to be much more organized. And like you said, the resources it takes to actually get that done in comparison to an automated system is a little bit harder.
Absolutely. So that's Track. Now, certainly we use that as the platform of this next offering, but I'm going to just let Laura run on this one because this is her baby. So we also, for anybody that's looking for more help, Track is obviously something that you can use, and we have the ability for you to get some help and get it up and running and things like that. And it's a great tool if you're able to manage it on your own. But if you're sitting there saying, I want to get as much of this off my plate as possible, we do have a service that we call vendor management as a service. So Laura, like I said, I'm just going to turn this over to you. I know it's very customizable. I know that you've worked a lot on making sure that it's going to be a really effective and beneficial service for the people that take part in it. But why don't you tell us a little bit about it and maybe some of the different offerings that we've got as part of it?
So originally, it starts off with the sales executive discussing what your needs are. So we do as little as 3 reviews for a client, and we do as much as their whole entire vendor relationship portfolio. So we have both ends of the spectrum. So we do review all vendors for probably 5 clients now. So after it's determined what your actual needs are, then you would have a kickoff with the vendor management team. And so what we would do is we would look and track, make sure that all the vendor relationships you have are listed. We would go in and complete a risk assessment to make sure that everyone looks good and what documentation that we need. And then we'll build out a schedule over the next 12 months. So, if you have 12 vendors, we're not going to do them all at once. We're going to spread them out. So it just makes it a lot easier to do. Then once we complete those reviews, we do both due diligence and contract reviews. Once those are completed, we notify the client. And what that client does is they go in and they review behind us. So we rate our answers and the questions on a scale from 0 to 5. So 5 being the best. So you would go in and look, say, oh, well, Laura has rated this one a 1. Let's see what that problem is. After the client reviews it and it's good with the work that's been completed, then they actually finalize it. So that's how it keeps it. So you're the one that is responsible, that you understand the review has been completed. So it still involves you in it as well. And then usually we'll meet with the client on a monthly or quarterly basis according to how many reviews you're getting done. So we keep that line of communication open. For some, we actually attempt to gather documentation because that's always a pain. pain for everyone to try to gather that documentation. So a lot of times we'll actually attempt to gather that documentation to make the process still just a little bit easier. And we do have an option to look at financials to do some trending work to show you how they look year to year to see if there are any issues that you would note. So that's pretty much at a high level what we do.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the really cool things about our version of it, and I can't speak to I know there are other companies that offer something similar, obviously, but I like how customizable it is. And you hit on that at the top, but we literally have a document that we go through and we say, do you want us to do this? And you say yes or no. Do you want us to do this? Yes or no. And it's everything from how many vendors you want us to look at to do you want us to be kind of a mentor in terms of teaching somebody at your institution or organization in terms of how to do vendor management as part of this? Do you want us to talk to the board? Do you want us to go to IT committee meetings? Again, it's just a really customizable offering that, people might hear vendor management as a service and think, well, I don't really need that because I don't need, I don't need somebody doing all of it for me. We really can tailor this to the needs of anybody that's out there. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So. And then I should also mention that Track is kind of the backbone of that. We do allow you to, Track is not included as part of vendor management as a service, but certainly the vast majority of our clients that are using that service license Track as well, because they're able to have insight into the process as it's moving, pull reports, do work on additional vendors that might not be covered under the work that SBS is doing for you. So I think it's an excellent service. It's something that we continue to mature and it continues to evolve. And I think it's just going to be more exciting, but also more helpful going forward. And as we talked about, for those of you that may have in the past thought, well, I'm a little leery about outsourcing this, or I'm a little leery about having, getting help with it because guidance doesn't really say whether or not we can do that. They've flat out come out and said, hey, get help if you need it. So I think that hopefully that assuages some concern there. And we'd be happy to talk to you about it. And again, I'll have some polls up here if you want to get some additional information about that as well. So with that said, let's just talk about some takeaways. And then I know we're wrapping things up here. I might pop in to see if we've got a couple of questions I can answer or Laura can answer. But just some takeaways for you. Using vendors is critical to operating any organization or institution. We all know that. And it's also much more likely that you'll be using more vendors in the future and not fewer. So while we may think that this might get easier down the road, that's not necessarily the case. It is a headache, but it's important, and doing it well doesn't necessarily mean more work. It just means better work. And again, you can get some help with that. The interagency guidance represents some minor but significant changes, greater coordination between agencies. It should be considered as part of your overall risk management. Vendor selection should be documented and taken seriously. Contracts as a critical control. And then if you need help, get it. So those are some of the bigger changes that we addressed. And then finally, depending upon how much help you are looking for, we have some great ways to assist there. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to throw some polls up. I'm also going to take a look and see if we had any questions come in. So bear with me, again, kind of getting used to Teams as a method to deliver these things. So I'm going to launch a few different polls in the chat. You should be able to take a look at those, hopefully here shortly. Although it might not let me launch more than one at a time. So I'm going to go ahead and launch them a little bit more slowly. I'm also going to pop up and see if we've got any questions that were asked. So Laura, one that came in is, does the guidance or any guidance touch on fourth party vendors? And I know that this one in particular did have some information about fourth party and subcontractors. Do you want to speak to that?
So there are a tremendous amount of subcontractor questions in there in the guidance. The problem is the SOC reports are still kind of lagging on what they're relying on. And then the contract, we're actually looking for subcontractor statements in the contract, and those really aren't being addressed as well either. I do know that we do a handful of fourth party in our vendor management as a service. So we basically take the same question set and the same documentation.
Sure, absolutely. So let me see. I think there's some that came in the chat, so I'm going to take a look there as people are answering some of our poll questions. A vendor would be considered one per SOC report, correct? Is that in terms of our vendor management as a service? That's the way we do it. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is correct. Because each SOC report takes anywhere between 2 to 3 hours to review, according to how involved it is. So yes, so that's how it is calculated.
And then the last one, at least for now, is what should be required from a vendor from a cyber perspective? Should there be cyber insurance required? Should a cyber rated be conducted through an outside vendor? Do you have any thoughts on that at all?
So the first question is, we do look at insurance, and I always look to see how much insurance is involved in the cyber insurance. It's usually at the bottom of the certificate of insurance. So based on how much insurance they have is kind of the rating that we provide. And then the cyber risk part. So I know that some of our competitors actually do have that built in, and we are looking to do that in the future, those cyber risk assessments. So that's something that is on our plan and our goal to actually get done sometime in the future.
Absolutely. So I think that's it. People are jumping off. I know we're at the top of the hour, so I appreciate Laura. Thank you so much for jumping on. I thank everybody for attending. I did put our contact information up here. If you want a copy of the recording of the webinar, we have that. We also will have the slide deck available as well. So just feel free to shoot me an email if you're interested in either of those pieces. If you're interested in track or vendor management as a service, feel free to reach out to me as well. And then any questions you might have of Laura, I'm sure she'd be okay with you reaching out to her as well. So I'm going to stick around. I'll leave this up on the screen. Anybody who asks a question that we did not get to, I'll make sure we get to you. But again, thanks everybody. Hopefully you'll join us next month. And Laura, thank you so much for your time here today.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.